Thank you very much, and thank you for including me in this wonderful two-day event. So I have no conflicts of interest relevant to this content. So Rich spoke to you about sponsor PI. I'm going to start with PI and institution in terms of the challenges and potential solutions. So I think that we have discussed this mandate for a single IRB review of multi-site trials, which would potentially improve the substantive IRB review and redundant, conflicting reviews and expectations, many of which we heard about yesterday with one IRB having rules set in stone that another IRB said that's not based on regulation and you can do it. I think it would potentially end hours and hours of what I call ping-ponging between the IRB and the investigator, back to the IRB to the investigator, and then with individual IRBs, clearly increase the efficiency of study startup and ease administrative burden, at least for the full IRB. So as Rich talked about, there are many different stakeholders, and those include sponsors, institutions, PIs, and the sponsors, industry, NIH, and PCORI. All of these have different expectations, different preferences, and different biases about adoption. And there are very many, and now an increasing number of models for IRB reliance. So there are the independent IRBs, Western, Chesapeake, Quorum, et cetera. There's the NCI Central IRB. Then each now of the institutes have their own version of a central IRB. NINDX has something called NeuroNext IRB, which is run in an academic center. The NICHD has a federated model that they're moving from. The VA has yet a different model that they're employing. And the institutional reliance agreements also have about 5 or 6 basic models of how one relies, what is done centrally, what is done peripherally, how much locally, how much information is shared. There is enormous administrative confusion. The offices, the IRB offices, when they're involved in 5 or 6 different models of reliance, they don't know who they should contact for what. They don't know whether it's their responsibility to inform the sponsor or the regulatory bodies. It depends on who you're contracting with and what that written agreement says. And the poor study coordinators that are trying to do their job and have no real guidance and expectation, it's much more confusing now. There's also increased administrative burden, or at least continued administrative burden, for the administrators in the IRB offices. We have now one person fully assigned to simply track which IRBs are going where and under what model, and therefore how they are supposed to move forward. Many of our institutions feel that we know our players best. We know our investigators. We know the ones we trust and not trust. And we know the ones we want to keep a special eye on. So that's another issue. Institutions really do have a fear of liability. I think that's ill-founded, but often stated. And then there's a huge issue with trust. I mean, we all trust ourselves, and we don't trust the person or the IRB next door to us. So one of the major, challenges there was to show that we could do it at the Harvard institutions, because if we could trust each other, then pretty much we could trust anybody. So the Harvard Catalyst is the Harvard CTSA. We are all separate institutions with the exception of some of the Harvard schools. We're legally and financially separate. The faculty are not Harvard employees of all the Harvard affiliates. And just to show you what the challenge was, these are all the collaborating centers for the CTSA. And just to tell you what give you some sense of the challenge here, it took me literally a month to get permission to put the logos on the slide. So starting with that, we then set out some time ago to to see if we could develop a system that was more conducive to collaboration. And I'm happy to say that now the Harvard Catalyst Reliance Agreement has adopted under a single agreement all of these schools and hospitals, and is now being extended regionally. Bay State just joined last week, and several other regional are collaborating and are considering it. So I thought I'd spend a minute about how we developed this and what we've done, because I do think it's scalable and certainly flexible enough to be aligned some of the other institutions. So there's a Master Common Reliance Agreement creating the framework for a reviewing IRB and a relying institution. The relying institution, it's an institutional role. It's not the relying IRB. Once the institution relies on another, then that IRB is the IRB of record, and the institutional IRB no longer has a role. It is able to accept or reject the idea of reliance on a case-by-case basis, and that is made by the site PIs before a written protocol is substantially sent in order to save all of the effort of writing a protocol in your form and your, sort of all of your format and all that sort of stuff. It does eliminate duplicative IRB entirely when it's accepted. As I said, it does mean that some administrator has to approve the relying or reviewing, but the work of the full IRB is saved. So, and it does promote collaboration, reduces the administrative burden and the costs for the IRBs and study teams. So there are lots of things you have to think about to make this work. And I think part of what we need to do nationally is to really define the roles and responsibilities of the reviewing IRB and the relying institution. Clarify that, set up systems that are not confused with what the IRB does. Many of our institutions have embraced the idea that the IRB office does X. It's the Human Research Protections Office that does X. The IRB is the reviewing piece. And the more one teases out all the other functions that we've dumped on these poor IRB offices, the better we're going to be able to deconstruct that and put institutional sort of efforts around making that those routes work, and then and be able to rely on the IRB, which is an ethical determination rather than all of the other things we've embodied in that office. So obviously you need a federal-wide assurance. You have to decide who's going to do the initial conflict of interest review, and then of course it has to go to the IRB of record for their review. HIPAA, we now cover both covered entities, non-covered entities, and hybrid entities. We have notice of deadlines, policies, research agreements. We make sure that the IRB approval does not activate the study, so that the institution can then do all of its other surround sound that it needs to do before that study gets activated at the site. We have procedures for serious and continuing noncompliance. We had to align subject injury language to make sure that we were not promising a route of therapy or for untoward events in one institution that was not acceptable to another institution. Work on research compliance audits, who was going to do what, record keeping and confidentiality. We did develop a seed review form in order to track all of this because people didn't remember who they were relying on for which protocol in what setting. We decided that the default to inhibit IRB shopping was for the institution that employs the investigator to be the institution of record of the overall PI, unless the that institution chose to rely on another. And they do that for varying reasons, such as expertise of the other IRBs and other issues, which I can discuss. HIPAA flexibility, there's common research subject injury language now across all the institutions. The reviewing IRB retains authority once it's seated. You can't take it back because you don't like what they said. And there's a definition of the approval versus activation, as I mentioned, and we've developed now a whole slew of common policies and procedures, such as education, audit, security and breach, et cetera. And in each of those buckets, which I've sort of glanced over, we did pick through all of the little pieces. For instance, in serious and continuing noncompliance, these are the things that we sort of spelled out, who's doing what, when, where, so that there was no confusion. If there was serious noncompliance, you look at the master reliance agreement and you know who's going to do what and how. So just to give you some sense, we've now done over 1,100 reviewed applications in this system. 86% accepted review or relied upon another, and 14% decided not to. And if you look at the reason that they decided not to, you know, there's some, like, you can't believe it, but like some were not human subjects research, some were not engaged in research and then therefore didn't have to rely or review. There was some feedback. There's local IRB. There was already an IRB that had reviewed it. The seed arrangement was already in place, and therefore they didn't need this. They decided not to choose review and to seed review, and we're looking into that a little bit more carefully. Most applications included 2 or more sites, and one site had 8 applications, which for the small group is nevertheless significant. Interestingly, the external sites most commonly decided not to seed review. So this goes back to trust, and this goes back to exposure and to comfort. And initially when we started this, nobody wanted to rely or review. They wanted control over it, and they didn't want anything to be, they wanted everything based on a person-to-person conversation. So we set up the system. A year later, they're going, why do we have to make the telephone call? Can't we just automate it? So it is something that people do get comfortable with. And I think we need to embrace that for our IRBs and make it okay for them to have that complexity, have that issue, and then get familiar with each other and familiar with moving forward. So you do need a written IRB authorization agreement. There's, as I mentioned, clarity of roles of reviewing IRB and the relying institution. I think it's really important to be clear and to establish the channels of communication, who's responsible for what, when they call, who do they call, who do they report to, and then to agree on certain templated informed consent language. For the institution, I think the state law remains your own responsibility. It's very hard across these networks to understand all of the state laws unless you're one big central IRB or an independent IRB. I still think that the investigator and team competency assessment and education remains the responsibility of the institution. Initial conflict of interest review and management, I think, is important for the institution to retain, and then once they send it forward, the IRB will either improve, agree, or disagree. One needs to make sure that all the pieces of the IRB office and function that used to be just relegated through usually system administration to connect with other pieces of the organization have now got an alternative route than the sort of system workflow fix that we all introduce. So you need to make sure you're aligned with your grants and contracts office, your contracting group with for industry sponsors, for the institution, IBC, for nursing, pharmacy, privacy, et cetera, and then non-compliance in reporting. We've made a number of a number of educational and sort of service tools available on the web to help with this so that we can really start to reduce the duplicative effort at training and understanding and moving this all to a better quality platform. It's all on the web. You're all invited to download it. So So I think as I think through the path forward, we do need agreement and some incentives, as we spoke about yesterday, on the necessity of increasing single-site IRB review for multi-site research. I do think there's an advantage to having many different central IRBs. I don't think that it's a great thing if we end up with 3 or 4 national independent IRBs that review everything. That's a personal prejudice, and I'm sure it's a prejudice. I do think we need to centralize the central IRBs because now we've got too many models out there and too many sort of ways of doing business and clarity of roles and responsibilities. And I look forward to coming back next year and talking about compensation for subject-related injury, which by then we will have fixed everything else and we'll go on to more challenging issues than this. So thank you.